Hey everybody, I'm with Elina Xenophontos today, our geopolitical analyst. She was on last time regarding Syria, and we're here to speak again regarding the latest developments in Syria. Lena, thanks so much for joining today. If we could start from the very beginning, as of the past, let's say, week and a half, how did the recent escalations happen in Syria? And we've been seeing some Israeli involvement. So if we could just kind of do a comprehensive overview of what's been going on, that would be great.
All right. Well, what happened basically this week is that we saw an escalation take place by the, sort of sectarian violence sort of breakout between the Bedouin tribes and obviously the Druze community. And, the Bedouin tribes sort of initiated these attacks under sort of the protection of, HTS and basically government kind of militant or authority. And to be very honest with you, this isn't something that's particularly new for Syria. I mean, pretty much since December 8th, which is when Assad essentially fell, we've been seeing the systematic violence between different factions within Syria take place, pretty much immediately. And this was going to be pretty much the outcome, fundamentally because of the type of people that came into power in Syria to begin with. Because, as I think we discussed in the previous episode, although we just touched on it very briefly, is that obviously Jelani, the administration, and the vast majority of the people that kind of make up this new Syrian transitionary, I guess, government, they belong to, opposition groups, and organizations that essentially were affiliated to far right, I guess, Islamic extremist ideology, with links to ISIS and Al Qaeda, and a lot of their militants and a lot of these kind of soldiers, or whatever you would like to call them, they adhere to this particular ideology. And so it was pretty much, I guess, from the very beginning, we knew that when they would come into a position of power, a lot of these factions that have adhere to these very extremist ideologies were going to start engaging in sectarian violence because they believe in the establishment of like this Islamic state, this Islamic sort of Sunni supremacist ideology. And that's essentially what began from the very beginning to manifest within Syrian society. We initially saw it, transpire, particularly reached an epitome in March with the killings and the attacks and the massacres against the Alawite community. That never really stopped after March. It just hasn't been reported on because the kind of escalations of violence would sort of change. We also saw, obviously, the bombing of the Orthodox Church just last month, and now we're obviously seeing the same kind of sectarian violence take place between the Druze and the Bedouin under this sort of kind of conditions that have been created inside Syria as a result of putting into power, a group essentially that adheres to these kind of far right ideologies. And I mean, if I could expand on that a little bit more to say as well that including before this began to take place, just a few days prior, I think it was, we also saw fires on the coast, essentially, of Syria, which a group known as the Soraya Ansar al Sunna, which is basically an affiliate of HTS. They apparently split from HTS in the beginning of February, again, conducting fires for the purpose of kind of pushing out the Alawites from Syria, from their communities, and also obviously targeting them and killing them. So this isn't an isolated incident for Syria. This has become pretty much the state, like the state of affairs throughout Syria.
Definitely. And from the beginning when this new government first took power, I remember in their first speech, Jelani said something that he's going to be a president for all the people of Syria. Clearly, things seem to be transpiring differently. Do you think that this will continue the way it is? Do you think the government is actually putting in due diligence to care for the minorities, or do you think that's just a farce that they've been stating then?
I would say it's just a farce. And again, going back to the fires that were recently taking place, including the church bombing, we have an abundant amount of information that states that essentially Soraya Ansar al Sunna is responsible for these attacks, and they actually took responsibility for those attacks. And even when the members of the administration of HTS had visited the site, they had categorically rejected not just that Soraya Ansar al Sunna were responsible, but that they didn't even exist, even though they were the ones that assumed responsibility for those attacks. And the Syrian establishment had basically tried to claim that these attacks were conducted by ISIS, which is quite a bizarre statement to make, given the fact that ISIS itself did not take responsibility for these attacks, which is something that is quite unusual, because usually when ISIS is responsible for attacks, they would take responsibility, they would assume that responsibility. So it can only be assumed that the reason the HTS administration is refusing to sort of acknowledge Soraya Ansar al-Sunnah is fundamentally because it's providing protections for militants that were part of HTS, essentially, who have now de jure split, but who seem to be exercising I guess, practices that were pretty much the principle within HTS over the course of the last decade based on their ideologies up until this point. And I would also like to mention at this stage that even by Western media outlets, including, I think it was the Washington Institute, published a report to say that the recent attacks have been taking place by organizations that have been or formerly were associated with HTS, but they're providing a cover for them. And for the most part, we haven't seen the new establishment in Syria sort of take responsibility in terms of kind of taking in these militants that are obviously acting in this form of aggression. But this is the fundamental point that I think a lot of people need to understand, is that when the West, Israel, including Turkey, including the Gulf monarchs, but particularly let's just focus on the West here for a second in Israel, when they were arming and funding the Syrian opposition and groups like HTS or Al Nusra, which was what HTS was formerly known as, and there's abundant amount of evidence proving this fact. They did so knowing full well that when essentially Assad would be overthrown, by placing these radicals in a position of power, it would kind of breed the necessary chaos that would provide the West and Israel with the pretext that they are looking for in order to basically divide Syria, occupy Syria, and basically kind of completely weaken the country and subjugate it firmly within Western rule. This was the entire purpose of placing radicals in a position of power. Because at the end of the day, even if Jelani himself has issued statements and warnings, please do not engage in sectarian violence, we're trying to unify, we want the minorities to feel safe. The reality of the situation, and this is obviously then verified by the kind of material that is coming out of Syria at the moment, the footage that we're seeing, is that a lot of these fighters, they do harbor very violent ideologies, and that will be very difficult to control. This is why, and the West has a history of doing so, they arm and fund radicals. It's irrelevant what the ideology is, whether it's blatant fascism, Nazism, the furthest, the most extremist, kind of Salafist ideology. They will arm, fund, and support these ideologies because what it does, it paves the way for divide and rule. And that has been a systematic approach for Western imperialism, not just within West Asia, but throughout the world. And this is effectively, I guess, what the plan was all along. And I would actually like to reference at this point very quickly that if you go back to, I think, January, right at the beginning of January, so about 3 weeks after the fall of Assad in Syria, we had, I think, I-24 News in Israel that were publishing, I guess, leaked documents. And this was kind of published actually throughout all Hebrew media, whereby the Israeli establishment, alongside the US, were calling for international intervention inside of Syria in order to establish what they called administrative cantons, which is basically, dividing Syria into different into like segregating into different sort of semi-autonomous regions, for the Druze, for the Kurds, for the Sunnis, for the Christians, etc. And in doing so, they were calling for the international sort of peacekeeping forces, which is for the most part NATO states, to kind of facilitate this project, to bring in these peacekeeping forces and to essentially fracture Syria and take control over Syria and prevent the Syrian people from ever unifying and opposing any sort of resistance to Israel ever again, and also to, I guess, the demands that the U.S. has from that particular region. This was always the plan for Syria, and we're just basically seeing that manifest.
Absolutely. That's why immediately after this new government took power, the first thing Israel did is completely wipe out Syria's prior military infrastructure, correct?
Correct. The objective was to create a Syria that could no longer be able to defend itself, because at the very least, under Assad, it was still a state. It was a unified state. There wasn't this kind of sectarian violence that we're seeing today, and they also had military infrastructure. They had the sort of military infrastructure that Syria could use to defend itself. That has now been obliterated. I think something like 93 to 94% of Syria's military and defense infrastructure was effectively destroyed. And obviously, right after, I guess, the fall of Assad, we saw also Israel expand into the south of Syria and essentially controlling Syria with ease, and even making demands along the lines of, the south of Syria must be demilitarized. This was a demand that Israel had effectively made. I mean, Syria is supposed to be a sovereign state. Why Israel feels it has the capabilities to be able to enter into Syrian territory and to demand that it's going to become demilitarized, is very sort of emblematic of what was actually the objective here, and that was to have Syria to be able to control Syria and all its resources, and to prevent Syria, like I said, from ever being able to reestablish itself. I also kind of wanted to make a point with what's happening that I think is often kind of missed, and that is the particular point in time that the recent escalation has sort of happened in Syria, and the fact that this time, Israel decided to bomb and target Syria's defense ministry, which was quite a significant escalation that was targeting obviously senior officials in HTS. Because up until this point, yes, we saw Israel occupying the south, and we saw Israel take over Mount Hermon. And obviously, when they took Mount Hermon, which itself is a fundamental and one of the most significant geostrategic locations in the region, because it's one of the highest points in West Asia that allows for mass surveillance and therefore control that Israel can execute over the region, over Palestine, over Lebanon, and basically any sort of resistance force to its own power and authority in the region. They obviously were also able to control and took significant portions of Syria's water resources, which again is part and parcel of controlling Syria, because Syria is as valuable as, water is as valuable as oil. And if you're able to control a country's water ports in the way that Israel controls the vast majority of the water in the region, you're able to control their economy. But in addition to that, like we said, it also destroyed, the military infrastructure of Syria, but it never directly targeted, Jelani and his administration in the way that we saw in the last few days. And the interesting aspect is that this escalation happened at exactly the same time that there were reports coming out of Syrian media as well as Hebrew media that obviously there were normalization talks happening behind the scenes, behind closed doors. And what was being reported at the time was that effectively, Syria was looking to accept normalization and to even accept, the complete annexation of the Golani Heights officially, and also more, occupation of Syrian territory in exchange for, apparently, Tripoli, which is in the north of Lebanon. And this was what was reported, like I said, in Hebrew media and in Syrian media. Now, the reason I bring this up, it's because it's the north of Lebanon and everything that's going on right now with regards to Lebanon and Hezbollah is directly, obviously, connected with Syria, because as it currently stands, if Syria was to occupy the north of Lebanon, which to me is absolutely insane, the fact that Israel and Syria are having these conversations behind closed doors, Lebanon is still a sovereign state. With what right are they having these conversations? Oh, and one to add to that, we also have to remember that Tom Barrack, which is the U.S. ambassador to Turkey and the U.S. envoy to Lebanon, only last week also stated that if Lebanon doesn't take the necessary action to essentially disarm Hezbollah, that effectively Lebanon would risk being taken over by and occupied by Syria and Israel, therefore reaffirming those reports of those conversations happening behind the scenes. But this is the important aspect here, that at the end of the day, Jolani and his administration is far closer aligned to Turkey and serves Turkey's interests more so than it does the West, and more so than it does Israel. And so there's also been a lot of reports that have come out of uh, Cradle and Al Mayadeen, referencing Lebanese intelligence that were reporting that Syria and Turkey are smuggling weapons and militants into the north of Lebanon, particularly in the area of Tripoli. And more so, they're also reporting on finding massive Syrian cells inside Lebanon. And on the 1st of July, in fact, Lebanon, the Lebanese intelligence were able to put a stop on a massive terrorist attack that, and these were the reports published by The Nation as well, and to directly quote, mirrored that of the pager attacks that were obviously conducted by Israel. So Lebanon is in a situation where they're trying to obviously deal with the situation in the south, Hezbollah, a lot of political pressures as well that are coming in from the west. But also, they're dealing with massive security breaches and concerns in the north that is directly related to Syria and to Turkey. And the reason I bring this up is because Turkey itself recently, there were reports that Turkey was quite outraged by the fact that the president of Lebanon, Aoun, had visited Cyprus, and Turkey viewed this as a direct threat to Turkey's interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. And the reason I say this is because Turkey has claimed they claim that they have some historical rights to the north of Lebanon via this sort of neo-Ottoman rhetoric that's particularly more specific to Erdogan himself. But the reality is that Turkey wants access to Tripoli because the Tripoli port is one of the largest and most important in the region, and it would rival the Haifa port and is larger than the Tel Aviv port. And Turkey, that itself is occupying territories within the north of Syria, wants to become an energy hub, a trade hub within the region, which is why they're also occupying certain strategic locations in the north, including Syrian airports, and why they would want, and this is again based on like a really good article that I saw and some intelligence reports that are coming out of Lebanon, referenced by the Cradle. Israel is therefore afraid that if Syria, that is demanding control over Tripoli, is given that kind of ability, that Turkey will be able to control the north of Lebanon through their relations and de jure kind of control through, Jolani. And so, what we're also seeing take place right now in Syria is also the result of sort of conflicting interests of different powers within the region. Israel and Turkey had already has a bit some standoffs in the last few months in Syria, if you remember, telling Turkey to essentially back off and prevent its own expansionism within Syria. And we're kind of seeing the same thing take place now in the north of Lebanon. And it's always important to remember that beyond the smuggling of, weapons and militants, which again, according to the Lebanese intelligence sources that the Creator has even referenced, they're very questionable as to their links within Syria. Beyond that, the northern part of Lebanon, and Tripoli in particular, beyond being the second largest city, is also known as the Sunni city of Lebanon. And it's where the vast majority of Syrians reside. And it's also, over the years, over the last 10 years, Turkey has been exercising a lot of soft power in the north of Lebanon, kind of exploiting the impoverished conditions throughout Lebanon, and particularly within those regions, providing all these forms of humanitarian sort of assistance and these Turkish related programs to push for like very pro-Turkish, I guess, religious and ideological kind of narratives. And this is part of the soft power that Turkey has sort of been imposing on the North in order to kind of create this, again, sort of ignite the sectarian tensions within Lebanon. And this is what they're banking on to do in Lebanon as well in order to disarm the resistance. But going back to Syria, the reason why this is connected is because Israel and the United States do not want Turkey to continue having any sort of, control or within the region, and to put an end to Turkey's adventurism. This is also playing a significant role because, given, like I said, the particular timing of this attack on the Syrian Defense Ministry and the direct I guess, aggression now towards the Syrian, I guess, the new Syrian regime or administration, whatever you would like to call it, happened at this specific time that these talks were taking place with regards to controlling Tripoli, etc. And I believe that this is the West and Israel kind of warning Jolani and Turkey that this is where they draw lines, that Israel and the West are going to remain the more powerful fractions within the region, because at this stage, what Turkey is hoping, like I said, to become is to become a hub and a very powerful actor. And the West and Israel do not want a powerful actor like Turkey in the region that itself is rather exploitative. Um, and just like a small little reference, just to like kind of, I guess, synopsize all of that, is the fact that in 2019 Turkey had actually made agreements with the Libyan state in order to establish a new exclusive economic zone between Libya and Turkey in order to cut through Greece's exclusive economic zone. And also in the north of Cyprus, they claimed the gas reserves and particular trade routes within the north of Cyprus, which technically is supposed to be, at the very least, the by Turkish standards, and the sort of their chain of argumentation is that it's not occupied; it belongs to the Turkish Republic of the North of Cyprus. That is a separate entity. But regardless, even though that's questionable within itself, the gas reserves belong to the Cypriots in the north, the Turkish-speaking Cypriots in the north. But Turkey's making a claim on that as well. So what we're seeing is Turkey like position itself within the Eastern Mediterranean, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Lebanon, Cyprus, and obviously in Libya as well, in order to become a sort of a powerful actor that directly threatens Western interests in Israel. So I believe that this is also what we're seeing currently take place, and Israel effectively just took advantage of the sectarian violence that's been happening for 8 months. It's not new, in order to kind of beat Jelani into submission, to get him to realize that we are the ones you're going to have to worry about, not Turkey. We will not allow you to serve Turkey's interests in the region.
Absolutely, that's a very comprehensive overview regarding Turkey's interests there, and I just want to circle back to Jolani in general, because the way he came to power and the way HTS came to power is so odd to me. It happens within 24 hours after the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah at the time. To me, it felt
Mhm.
like did that not feel planned at all? Like, when I say planned, did that not feel not just planned by HTS, but did that not feel calculated by Israel's from like there's no way to me that Israeli intelligence, the Mossad, had no knowledge that immediately after the ceasefire HTS would plan such an attack. I felt like it came about too perfectly for Israeli interests. This is obviously speculation, but what are your thoughts on just the timing of how Jolani took power?
Oh, I wouldn't say speculation. I think you're 100% correct in what you're alluding to here, because um, I had actually I was on another show right on the day that the ceasefire was announced. And I had actually said that people should pay attention to Syria. I said it on the very day the ceasefire with Hezbollah had been announced. Why? In the very same speech that Netanyahu gave that day to announce the ceasefire with Hezbollah, he actually warned Assad. He issued threats to Assad on the very same day, and I was trying to tell people, to warn people, that we need to look out for what's going to happen in Syria. And I think a lot of people didn't pay attention, but the goal specifically was to actually establish a ceasefire with Hezbollah, to then be able to focus on Syria. And actually, if you go back even a couple of months, I had actually also reported on this, that over the course of last summer, so I would say between May to, yeah, I mean, from May onwards, there were multiple reports that were coming out. Even Amnesty International have reported on this, that the SDF forces in Syria, which the Kurdish forces, they were releasing en masse thousands of ISIS affiliated militants. And they had claimed that since they had signed a document saying they will not attack Kurdish forces, they were allowed to leave. So they were releasing all these Al Qaeda and ISIS related prisoners. And again, SDF has been funded and openly supported by the United States and by Israel. And so they were releasing these fighters inside of Syria at the same time that Hezbollah was obviously fighting. Fighting? There was this kind of controlled escalation constantly between itself and Israel. And what I had argued at the time was that I believed that they would basically use use the fact that Hezbollah has been distracted in the south of Lebanon, and obviously the overall chaos in the region and the Gaza genocide, in order to begin to arm and mobilize these militants inside of Syria, and basically target Assad. And I had actually said at the time, I hope the resistance factions don't forget Syria, because that's essentially where that was the biggest liability to the resistance. If Syria was to fall into the hands, I guess, of agents that have received funding and support by the West in that region. And actually, I think it was the Telegraph, it was a British media outlet, or the Guardian, that actually had said that British intelligence had actually had the heads up from about a month in advance of what was going to happen inside Syria. And they had warned, I'll actually find the article and I'll send it to you so you can link it. And they had warned the Syrian opposition, aka HTS, etc., that the opportune moment to strike was coming. So this was an organized attack on in Syria, and the very reason the ceasefire took place. And we have seen this with Israel, and we have seen this with the West, and that is whenever they are put forward any sort of ceasefire, it's usually because they are orchestrating a war on another front, or essentially going to use that time in order to reorganize and remobilize. And so when the ceasefire was announced in Lebanon, it was the opportune moment. They knew at that particular point they had in time, they had organized these factions inside Syria in order to basically attack Assad. And they had been doing that for several months, well, several years, but given last year, that was what was essentially happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And immediately after HTS took over, you already
Mhm.
mentioned Mount Hermon's strategic interests. It also completely flanked Lebanon from the east, cutting off
Mhm.
their necessary land. Or sorry, it flanked Hezbollah from the east, cutting off their necessary land bridge. Is there any flow of munitions, or is HTS completely blocking any flow of munitions that Assad would previously let through to Hezbollah?
It's hard to tell. I would say that the Hezbollah is probably able to get access to munitions and weapons. I don't think it's what it used to be. The reason I think that they are having access is also because Syria is in a state of chaos. Syria is a failing state, and these militants are chaotic. They're not exactly efficient military personnel. And the chaos, I mean, they're so primarily focused on targeting minorities inside Syria. I don't think they have such complete control over the Syrian border. Although, obviously, bear in mind, if we can recall, that after the fall of Assad, we did see HTS militants try to infiltrate Lebanon, and they were arrested by the Lebanese armed forces. However, I think they don't have the necessary control to secure those borders to the extent to cut Hezbollah off completely, but I do think that Hezbollah has been weakened. And I think it was a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago now, the new leader of Hezbollah, Kazem, he had actually said that losing, I guess, access to Syria, or seeing Assad falling in Syria, had the greatest single blow to the resistance. And it was something that he acknowledged. And as it currently stands, he actually gave a speech on Friday, the 18th, so that's 2 days ago of July, and he pretty much outlined that Lebanon right now and Hezbollah is facing, to quote as well Tom Barrack, the greatest existential threat, with Israel to the south, ISIS and basically the Western proxies and HTS to the east, and even within their own country, like I said, in the north, in the smuggling of weapons. And what we're looking in when we're looking at what's going to possibly happen in Lebanon is a push for sectarian violence that's going to put a lot of pressure on Hezbollah, whilst Israel and Syria are going to put pressure from the north and the east. So, this was the whole point of bringing down Syria, among many other things. The point was to completely deplete the axis of resistance, to weaken it, to fraction it, which would also weaken the Palestinian resistance in turn as well, to take over Lebanon, to secure the region for Western interests, to establish their trade routes and their pipelines that are meant to cut off Iran, to cut off China, to cut off Russia. This is about economic hegemony, and which is fundamental if you're going to essentially control the world economy and to sustain power.
Definitely, and what's so interesting is immediately after the regime change in Syria, it's almost as if it was a concerted social media effort from pro-Israel Zionist accounts beginning to talk about a Kurdish state. They actually said that now that Syria has had a regime change, now is the time to begin to push for free Kurdistan. You mentioned that Kurdish forces release ISIS into Syria. There seems to be a push from Israel to begin, in my eyes, occupy southern Syria and build a land corridor all the way up to the Kurds. Is that
Mhm.
currently what the aim is?
Yes, I would say it's the aim. And in fact, as well, Netanyahu, over the course of the last 10 years, has actually said on multiple occasions that the Kurds, that the Israel supports a Kurdistan, not because they care about the Kurds, but because they said they will become the moderate force to reshape the new Middle East. And so the objective was, by supporting the Kurds, was to fragment Syria and then, as you said, put forward the plans to kind of fragment Syria, but to connect the south with the Kurdish region, Kurdish controlled regions, and then to be able to establish a corridor that would break the resistance, that would fracture it, but also pave the way for the type of um, economic infrastructure that Israel and the West are planning for the region. And it's the David Corridor. That's what it's called, and we are seeing it play out in real time.
And Israel is using this excuse that it's protecting the Druze in order to
Mhm.
currently build that corridor, it seems.
Yes. But like I said, this was precisely the reason why you put extremists into power, because they knew they're going to attack the Druze. We knew that they were going to start killing people from different minority sects, so that then you can come and claim that, okay, well, we're here to provide peace and we're here to provide protection for the Druze. And I would also like to say one thing about the Druze community in Syria specifically, because there's been a lot of reports that kind of claim that the Druze are functioning as is agents of Israel, and that's not really the case at all. I mean, even if the Druze, for example, inside Palestine, although they have historically, yes, been Zionist assets and served the IDF, this is not the case with the Druze inside Syria, that were in fact even the spiritual leader, Hijri, apologies, I'm not pronouncing his name correctly, but he was actually, even following the 2011 protests in Syria, he was such a supporter of the Assad regime that, in fact, Druze members, he kind of lost support within the Druze community because of that, because he was very much a staunch supporter of sustaining Assad, because he specifically said that this is fundamental to the unity of Syria. And for the course of 10 years, he was very pro the axis of resistance. And this was pretty much the case until 2021, when relations somewhat soured as a result of economic corruption scandals and some differences between himself and Assad. However, he had often reiterated that for the unity and sanctity of Syria to remain, and to expel sort of, I guess, the influence of Israel and the West, he did support Assad for that reason, and that reason alone. We're only seeing the spiritual leader of Druze, of the Druze Syrians, kind of call for international protections now, and yes, even towards Israel, fundamentally because of the systematic attacks against the Druze communities that have been in various different forms taking place over the course of the last 8 months. And like I said, this was to be anticipated. This is exactly what Israel wanted. They wanted the violence, they wanted the bloodshed, because they wanted to balkanize and fragment Syria. And this is what is happening, and they're going to use the Druze. If it wouldn't be the Druze, it would be another community. It would be the Kurds. In the past, Netanyahu has claimed that he would provide support, even military, to protect the Kurds in the past. This was, I think, back in 2012. So this is blatant opportunism. And it was going to be given to Israel the moment that radical extremists came to power.
Alina, thank you so much for being on. This was so insightful. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, I hope the Israel doesn't succeed in its ambitions. That's what we can hope for.
Definitely. Have a great day. Take care. Bye.